Hello, one and all, and welcome to this video in which I will be giving my thoughts on the Stone Cold podcast with special guest, the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Overall, I enjoyed this episode of the Stone Cold podcast. If you've seen any of Austin's previous podcasts on the network, this is right up there as another enjoyable listen. I enjoyed the conversation between Austin and Flair. I thought they, covered a lot of good topics, and we'll get into a few of those. But definitely, if you have the network, check this podcast out. Not my favorite podcast done by Austin. That still goes to his interview with Vince McMahon, and then probably Paul Heyman, Triple H. But this was still an enjoyable to watch. So a couple things that were mentioned on this podcast. Stone Cold talked with Ric Flair about the plane crash that Flair was in the 70s. And Flair said that it was incredible that he walked away relatively unscathed. That was a significant moment in his life, obviously, and it was interesting hearing Flair talk about it. Flair also talked about his thoughts on feuding with the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, baby, and how working with Dusty was incredible, and he was really one of the all-time greats. And Flair told the story about how him and the Dream went to Las Vegas, and they spent like thousands of dollars on all these fur coats. So it was a lot of good stories told throughout this podcast from Ric Flair. Flair also talked about the impact of seeing his daughter Ashley, as we all know her, Charlotte Flair, and how she has been able to rise amongst the in the women's division. Her rise in the women's division. Flair also talked about when he lost his son Reid Flair, how it was a tough time for both him and Charlotte, and how the reason that she is in the business is to make her brother's dreams come true of making it in the business. And now that she's been able to do that, Ric Flair said that is the most proudest moment throughout his entire career. Flair also talked about his relationship with Triple H. He said Triple H is his best friend in the business. Now Triple H, how Flair told Triple H that he essentially trusts him, with taking his daughter Charlotte into the business and allowing her to succeed. And Flair put his trust in Triple H. That just goes to show you the type of the respect that both guys have for one another. Flair also, Austin asked him about his retirement match against Shawn Michaels in 2008, and Flair said those 3 days were something that he'll never ever forget. I'll certainly never forget it, as Ric Flair versus Shawn Michaels was the first match that I ever watched as a fan, and still gets me to this day. So it was definitely a great match, and a fitting send-off to the Nature Boy. And Flair talked about his Hall of Fame speech and how he was only supposed to go for a certain amount of time. It was well known his speech was a very long speech, and then afterwards he went to the back, and Vince was a little bit upset at him. And then Austin asked him Flair's relationship with Vince. Flair said he's always had a pretty good relationship with Vince. Told a couple funny stories, about working with Vince, and I'm trying to think what else they talked about. Some of his earlier work, in the NWA, and becoming, a professional wrestler. And then Austin also brought up the point and asked him, many consider you the greatest professional wrestler of all time. And then Ric Flair likewise told Austin that he feels that he is the greatest of all time. draw-wise, what have you, his impact to the business. So there's definitely a lot of respect between Ric Flair and Stone Cold Steve Austin, and it definitely showed throughout this interview. Like I said, it was an hour watch. The hour went by very, very, very fast. Also, Ric Flair said he loves what Triple H is doing down in NXT. He feels like it's much more, it's different than Raw, and we all know that it is. And it's much more simpler and easy to follow, and just gets to the bare bone basics, as Austin said. Um, when putting on a show about professional wrestling, and that's why NXT is such an enjoyable watch on a week-to-week basis. So it was nice hearing them touch on Triple H's work in NXT, seeing how Flair's daughter Charlotte was in NXT for the longest time. So yeah, this was a good listen. There were a lot of good stories told. Um, Not too much new that I learned from this interview. But there were a couple bit tidbits here and there. So definitely, I would recommend, if you have the network, please check out the Stone Cold podcast with special guest Ric Flair, because you most certainly won't be disappointed. It was entertaining, to say the least. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the podcast. Let me know down in the comments section below what you all thought of the Stone Cold podcast with Ric Flair. Stay tuned to more video content coming to this channel. My NXT review will be up sometime later tomorrow night, hopefully around 9. Plan to get that up, but no guarantees. Next week will be my live Raw review once again, and then my Royal Rumble predictions and previews video, as we are only 12 days away from the Royal Rumble, so definitely looking forward to that. And with that, I am out. Please click that like and subscribe button as well. So, hope everybody has a great day. And with that, I am out. Peace.